Hey, my name's Joseph and I make silly little video games with the intention of annoying my friends. Today's game is probably the most infuriating game I've made to date, and is also the most simple game I've made to date. Now you may be asking yourself, why has it taken over a month to make this game or this video if it's the simplest game you've ever made? And I want you to know the reason is not because I've been playing World of Warcraft nonstop, it's because I've been doing important adult things, like taxes, or housework, and being overcome with the imposter syndrome because I made a somewhat successful video on a topic I still feel like I know nothing about, and now I feel pressured to make a video and a game that's not only as good as the last one, but even better, so I can actually look back and say, hey, you learned something there, and not feel like I'm just wasting my time. Actually, you know what? Let's just say I was playing World of Warcraft the whole time. So I've realized something over the past few months of learning game development. I'm just being a little bit too selfish. I've been focusing on making games that I want to make or I want to play or have mechanics that I want to develop, and I've really lost sight of what's important, my friends, and how to make them miserable. So today we're going to take a step back and do something I probably should have done from the very beginning. I've even been saying it in the past few episodes. The goal of this series is to make games like Jump King, but worse because I'm a shitty game developer. But today we're actually going to do that. So the plan is to try to capture that main aggravating feeling you get from these types of games. You know, the feeling you get when you spend 45 minutes making just a little bit of progress in a game by carefully planning out every single movement and jump, only to make one tiny mistake and fall all the way back down to the beginning because, you know, you released your jump key a millisecond too early. And then pair that with a different type of movement because I do want to learn something from making these games, and honestly, learning how to make a character jump is not very interesting. Plus, I wanted to make a mechanic that was maybe a little bit more punishing. So I decided on a grappling hook. And that may not seem like it's that bad, but after working on and playtesting this game for over a month, I can tell you that having to not only aim the grappling hook, but also get the right angle and release the hook at the right time is miserable. So I think we made the right choice. Every time I start a new project, the first thing that I do needs to be something that's relatively easy. I need that instant gratification and dopamine hit to avoid, or at least to slow down the inevitable burnout that always seems to happen every time I start a personal project. But thankfully, I have no problem being gratified instantly, so something simple like getting a character to move is enough to motivate me. I did spend a decent amount of time making this cool little dash ability that I thought would be a really good addition to the game. It was just a way to actually manipulate your character while you're falling and even just speed up movements, and plus dashing in platformers is just kind of iconic. So I spent about half a day building in this dash that gives you a burst of movement speed, it lets you slow down your fall a little bit, and I built in this cool little animation that I thought looked really nice. And I finally got this mechanic into a spot that felt good to play. And after all that, I decided that, well, it just didn't fit the game. So I did something that I never do while coding. I made a comment. Well, I really just commented out the code that I already wrote, but when I come back in the future, I'll be able to look at this and know exactly how sad I was feeling, knowing that I just wasted 4 hours of my life. And speaking of being reminded about wastes of time, remember, if you're enjoying the waste of time that is this video, feel free to like it, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you can be notified next time I make a video that can waste 10 more minutes of your life. So moving on from the basic character movement, I decided it was time to actually build in the grappling hook. And after spending 2 hours following a 5-minute tutorial, I finally got it to work. Well, after like another 90 minutes of random debugging. But anyway, the mechanics behind the grappling hook are actually fairly simple. The player just shoots out an object, and when that object collides with something that it can grapple to, it just gives the player consistent velocity on that angle, and then when you release the grappling hook, gravity just takes care of the rest, and it just kind of works. Except for when it doesn't, but we're going to try to ignore those times because those sound like a problem for future me. And I heard that guy's an asshole and he deserves to have to fix these bugs. Anyway, with the base grappling hook done, I made some minor modifications to just make the game feel a little bit better. And by better, I mean more frustrating. I made it so once you grapple off the ground, you can't use your grappling hook again until you hit the ground, so you can't save yourself if you're falling. I also disabled movement after you've shot the grappling hook. That way, you can't do anything but helplessly watch yourself fall back to the beginning of the map when you make one tiny mistake. And then I did something that admittedly was a little bit too mean. During my initial playtests, I thought it was a little too easy that you could just aim the grapple wherever you wanted, so I built in this mechanic where you not only have to aim the grappling hook, but you also have to time it correctly. So when you click down your mouse, a rotating crosshair circles around your player, and when you release your mouse, the grapple shoots off in that direction. Now I got that mechanic completely working, and then I started to move on to other parts of the game, and I completely underestimated how absolutely god-awful this mechanic is. Now don't get me wrong, I do want to frustrate my friends, but I also want to make a game that's actually playable. I would also prefer to not receive death threats from people I've known for years. So in the interest of retaining what few friendships I've left, I eventually decided it was best if I just disabled that feature altogether. I did add a flag so I could re-enable this style of aiming whenever I want, but let's just pray to God that I don't ever do that, because it's honestly incredibly miserable, unfun, really difficult, and now I'm starting to convince myself to re-add this. But for now, we're not going to let the intrusive thoughts win, and we'll just leave it as it is. So now that the character could actually move, it was time to make stuff for the character to move to. I didn't want to just have boring old regular floors because I'm way too masochistic for that, so I started making some special tiles that I wanted to use to not only annoy my friends, but also confuse them, because who doesn't love seeing a tile that looks slightly different from every other tile that just happens to yeet you off the side of the map? Now, in the interest of making this game relatively playable, I made sure to keep these tiles fairly tame. I mean, the first one I made is just a breakable tile that just disappears if you stand on it for too long. Nothing really special here, but I did get to play around with some sprite animation with this tile. I mean, I didn't actually make any animations, it was more just copying a few different animations from a few different places and splicing them together. But even that was kind of interesting, and really cemented the fact that Art and I are at best distant relatives. The next tile that I worked on was the bounce tile. These are also fairly simple. All they do is add a burst of velocity to the player when the player stands on them. There's not really much more to say here. I'm realizing more and more that this game is not very interesting to talk about mechanically, but I already committed over a month to this project and it's kind of too late to back out now. Anyway, I did try to make these platforms so they could be either on an angle or upside down, and I ended up just deciding that it didn't really fit into the game. It definitely wasn't because I spent over 2 hours trying to figure out how to properly apply the correct directions of velocity and the amount of velocity based on the player's position and the direction of the bounce pad. It was definitely because I just didn't feel like it fit super well. Anyway, moving on to ice platforms. Now, we all know a good platformer needs some type of ice platform because everyone loves when they can't accurately control their character, right? Now, it's a good thing that I didn't decide to make this game open source, because if you look at the code behind the scenes specifically for these ice platforms, you would severely question how I've gotten this far in my life claiming that I program for a living. But I mean, hey, it works, kind of. It adds a directional velocity to the player that slowly diminishes over time, and walking in the opposite direction slows that slide down faster, just like every good ice block should, but it also sometimes randomly switches the direction that you're sliding if you hit the ice at a weird angle, or just like from midair at all. But by the time I found that interaction, I just was really done with the project, and I decided to just make the ice blocks part of the final few areas, and just hope and pray that no one cared enough about the game to make it that far. I mean, it works like 95% of the time, and the 5% of the time that it doesn't work, it only sends you back to the beginning of the game. But I mean, that's just the fun with these games, right? You lose to bugs. Anyway, I finished those tiles, and I did create one more type of special tile, a spinning trap that was supposed to shoot you off in a random direction when you hit them. And somewhere along the way, I just straight up lost it. I have literal video proof that I created these, but I seriously cannot figure out where I put this object in my file structure. And I didn't end up noticing this until I was pretty much done with the level building process, because I completely forgot about it. At that point, I just did not give a shit anymore, so the traps were unfortunately just lost to time. They weren't that interesting anyway, so this is really not that big of a deal. With the character movement finished and the tiles created, the main systems of the game were honestly pretty much done. There's really not too much that goes into the core mechanics of this type of game. So the next steps that I took were mainly just to add polish to everything. I created an actual game loop with a start and an end. I fixed some weird bugs with the grappling hook, and while fixing those, I found about twice as many more, and, well, if you play the game, you'll see where those ended up. I cleaned up some of the art, I added some menus, some sound effects, and I found this really cool bug that I spent hours trying to debug and fix, where the game would just suddenly crash for no reason when you hit grapple points at a certain angle. There's no error message, there's nothing, game just closed. I found some similar things online that had to do with shaders and different things, but I didn't have any of that in my game and I could not figure it out. until I realized I was just pressing the quit button, because for some reason when I set up the pause menu, I didn't disable it by default. It was invisible, but if you clicked on the buttons while it was not active, you still actually pressed the quit button. I literally spent 3 hours trying to figure out why the game was crashing when I was just pressing an invisible button over and over. Anyway, moving on from that, I added some backgrounds, cleaned up the camera, and then it was time to just fully focus on level design. For this entire project, I really wanted to put the focus on making a game that had mechanics that made sense and level design that was good. I do want to make an aggravating game, but part of the joy of these games is feeling the sense of progression and then immediately losing it. So I needed to make sure these levels were designed in a way that gave you just enough dopamine to keep playing, but just utterly destroyed your psyche if you made one tiny mistake. Unfortunately, I am not very creative, so I did what every good programmer does when they get big enough. I outsourced it. Well, kind of. I have a buddy of mine who's really interested in the actual game design of game development, and we just hopped on a call and spent a few hours just kind of going through each of these levels and building them out. And honestly, I think we did a pretty good job. The difficulty scales in a good way to kind of get you interested, teaches you the mechanics, and then just sends you back to the beginning, but it's got that sense of progression that kind of keeps you hooked. And I'm honestly not going to show you guys a lot of the level design because unlike the last 2 games I've made, I'm actually happy enough with this game to release it on itch.io. So if you want to actually try it out, there's a link in the description where you can give it a shot. Now, I do want to warn you, I'm like 95% sure that it is possible, but on the off chance that it's not, I'm sorry. I have beaten the different parts of the game independently, but it's not very easy. It does get a little bit too mean towards the end, so I do want to just give you that little bit of warning. But if you do end up liking it, let me know. I'm actually kind of interested in finishing this game, adding more levels to it, maybe add like 30 levels, polish it a bit more, add some new art styles, and release it as like a full game. But I don't really want to do it if it's not worth the time, so if you end up giving it a shot, if this is your kind of game and you enjoy it, let me know and give me your thoughts on the game as a whole. And now I think it's time to take a look at how this game turned out and see what my friends thought of this little game I made.
I'm washed. Oh,
Oh,
so
no.
washed.
Oh, no.
Okay, bro. All right. You added in the fucking crunching sound effect, huh? Oh no! No!
You dodged
I'm a
every
dodge
platform.
I was just gonna send it. No! 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 Oh god.
Is there a shoot self option?